Jess, you're never up this early.
Don't hate me. Why would I hate you?
6 months earlier, Sarah thought she'd survived the worst deed of her life. She was wrong. I want you to imagine finding out the person you trusted, with every secret you ever had, was the same person who blew your entire life apart, one lie at a time, smiling in your face the whole way through. This is a true story about the kind of betrayal that doesn't come from a stranger or an enemy. It comes from the person standing next to you at your own birthday party, the one who knows your coffee order, your childhood nickname, your deepest insecurities, and uses every single one of them against you. Stay until the end, because the twist in this one is worse than anything you're expecting right now. And if stories like this hit you the way they hit me, hit subscribe on Unfinished Tales right now, because I post one of these every single week, and you don't want to miss the next one. Sarah met Jessica in the 7th grade, back when friendship still felt simple, back when the worst betrayal either of them could imagine was someone stealing a seat at the lunch table. They grew up 2 streets apart in the same quiet Ohio suburb, spent every summer of their teenage years at the same community pool, and eventually moved to the same city after college because neither one of them could imagine building a life anywhere the other one wasn't. For 15 years, Jessica was the first person Sarah called with good news, and the only person she wanted in the room during the bad news. When Sarah met David at a mutual friend's barbecue, Jessica was the one who pushed her to give him her number in the first place. Nobody in Sarah's life would have guessed what was coming. David was steady in a way Sarah hadn't experienced before, the kind of steady that made her stop checking her phone every 5 minutes, because she finally trusted someone wasn't going to disappear on her. They dated for 3 years, moved in together after the second, and started quietly looking at engagement rings online during the third, the way couples do when they both already know the answer but haven't said the actual words yet. Sarah used to joke that Jessica was going to cry harder at the wedding than she was. She had no idea that the woman she was planning to ask to be her maid of honor had already decided, somewhere along the way, that she wanted David for herself, and that she was willing to burn Sarah's entire life down quietly enough that nobody would ever trace it back to her. It started small, the way these things always do. Jessica began mentioning, almost in passing, that David had seemed a little distant lately, a little short with her over text, a little quick to make excuses when plans changed. She'd bring it up gently, almost reluctantly, framing it as concern instead of gossip, the kind of comment designed to plant a seed without ever looking like she was the one holding the shovel. Sarah brushed it off at first. David was stressed at work. He'd just gotten a promotion. Of course he seemed distracted. But Jessica kept planting those seeds, week after week, month after month, small enough that Sarah never noticed the pattern, each comment landing exactly where it needed to land to keep the doubt alive without ever spiking it high enough to look suspicious. But planting small doubts wasn't enough on its own, so Jessica went further, and this next part is the one that still makes Sarah's stomach turn when she thinks about it. During his father's second surgery that year, David spent 3 straight nights in a hospital cafeteria, and Jessica was the one who sat with him through most of it, because Sarah had a work deadline she couldn't move and could only make it up there for a few hours each evening after. One of those nights, Jessica leaned in close over a cafeteria table and told David something Sarah had supposedly confided in her, something David never repeated to Sarah, never even brought up, just quietly let it sit and fester. Jessica said Sarah had told her she felt trapped, that all the hospital visits and the holidays reorganized around his father's illness were exhausting her, that Sarah had used the word tired more than once, tired of pretending, tired of putting her own life on hold. None of it was true. Sarah had sat in that same cafeteria herself, more nights than anyone knew, holding David's hand through the worst of it, terrified of losing a man who felt like family to her too. But grief makes people vulnerable to exactly the kind of lie Jessica knew how to tell, delivered gently, reluctantly, like she hated being the one to say it. And David carried that lie quietly for months, another small stone stacked on top of everything else, never once telling Sarah what he thought she'd said, just letting it change the way he looked at her a little more each day. Then the messages started showing up, not to Sarah's phone, but to David's, from a number he didn't recognize, flirtatious enough to make his stomach turn, signed with just an emoji instead of a name. He assumed it was a wrong number at first, until they kept coming, until one of them referenced a restaurant Sarah had actually gone to for a work lunch that same week. A detail David had no way of knowing unless someone close to Sarah had told him. He never suspected Jessica, because why would he? Jessica was the maid of honor. Jessica was the one who sat with him at the hospital when his father had surgery. Jessica was, as far as David knew, one of the two most trustworthy people in his entire life, and it never once crossed his mind that the messages destroying his trust in Sarah were coming from the second one. Quick question while we're here. If you already suspect who's behind this, drop your guess in the comments below. I want to see how many of you catch it before the reveal. The final piece came on a Tuesday night in March, when David found a hotel receipt tucked into the pocket of a coat Sarah swore she hadn't worn in months. It was dated for a night Sarah said she'd spent homesick with a stomach bug, texting Jessica for sympathy the entire evening because David had been out of town for work. The receipt had a name on it David didn't recognize, a man named Ryan, and a room booked for two. David didn't yell. He didn't even confront her right away. He just sat with it for 3 days, turning it over in his hands, feeling something inside him go cold and quiet, in a way he'd never felt before, until the weight of it became too heavy to carry alone anymore. When he finally showed Sarah the receipt, she didn't recognize it, didn't recognize the name Ryan, didn't understand what she was looking at, and told him as much, over and over, with a kind of desperate honesty that should have been impossible to fake. But David had already made up his mind by then. He told her he knew everything, that he'd seen the messages, that he wasn't going to stand there and let her keep lying to his face. Sarah stood in her own kitchen, begging a man she loved to believe her, swearing on her mother's life that she had never met anyone named Ryan, that she didn't know where the receipt came from, that someone was setting her up. David walked out that night and didn't look back, and Sarah spent the next 6 months believing the man she loved had simply stopped believing in her. She rebuilt slowly, the way people do after something like that. Therapy twice a week, a haircut she regretted almost immediately, long nights where she deleted his number and then reinstalled it and then deleted it again, just to prove to herself she could. Jessica was there through all of it, showing up with takeout and wine, sitting through every crying phone call, telling Sarah over and over that David didn't deserve her, that she was better off, that real love doesn't walk away over one misunderstanding. Sarah believed every word of it, because why wouldn't she? Jessica had been in her life longer than almost anyone. Jessica had never once given her a reason to look twice at anything she said, and grief has a way of making you cling harder to the people still standing next to you. 6 months after the breakup, on an ordinary Thursday morning, Sarah opened her front door to find Jessica standing there, holding a cream-colored envelope, her hand trembling just slightly around the edges of it. This is the exact moment you just watched. Sarah would replay that trembling 1,000 times later and still not fully understand how she missed what it meant in the moment. Jessica said she had news and handed over the envelope like it weighed 100 pounds, and Sarah opened it expecting almost anything except what was actually inside. Heavy cardstock, gold lettering, 2 names she read twice before her brain would let her process them. Jessica and David request the honor of your presence at their wedding. The mug in Sarah's hand slipped out of her fingers and shattered on the kitchen tile, and for a long moment neither woman said a single word. Sarah's eyes moved from the invitation to Jessica's face and landed, almost by accident, on the small curve of her best friend's stomach, on the hand resting there, just a little too naturally. 14 weeks, Jessica said quietly, watching Sarah's face for a reaction she clearly hadn't fully prepared for. She said it wasn't planned, that it happened after everything fell apart between Sarah and David, that she never meant for any of this to hurt her, that she hoped, somehow, Sarah could be happy for them. Sarah sat down on her own kitchen floor, glass crunching under her knees, and something in her chest cracked open that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with a question she hadn't let herself ask in 6 months. Who actually told David about the messages? Who actually knew about the coat? Who actually had a key to her apartment the whole time? The math started assembling itself in Sarah's mind faster than she could stop it. Jessica had been the one who introduced her to a coworker named Ryan at a birthday party over a year earlier. A friendly, forgettable introduction at the time. Jessica had been the one gently suggesting David seemed distant, week after week, long before Sarah noticed anything herself. Jessica had a key to Sarah's apartment for emergencies, had used it more than once to water her plants or grab something she forgot, had every opportunity in the world to slip a receipt into a coat pocket without anyone ever suspecting a thing. Sarah looked up at her best friend of 15 years and asked her, very quietly, who told David? Jessica's face went still in a way Sarah had never seen before, the frozen stillness of someone doing rapid math behind their eyes, trying to figure out how much had already been figured out. Sarah asked her to leave, and for the first time in 15 years of friendship, Jessica didn't argue, didn't apologize, didn't try to explain. She just left, and Sarah sat alone on her kitchen floor with a wedding invitation in one hand and 15 years of memory suddenly rearranging itself into something unrecognizable. Be honest with me in the comments. Would you have caught on this fast, or would it have taken you longer? I want to know where you'd have been in Sarah's shoes. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open until 3 in the morning, pulling up old text messages, mapping out timelines, trying to find the exact moment her best friend had decided to become the architect of her own destruction. By sunrise, the picture forming in front of her was uglier than anything she'd let herself imagine, and she knew she couldn't sit with it alone anymore. She called Ryan the next morning, the coworker from the receipt, a man she barely knew and hadn't spoken to since that one birthday party over a year earlier. He picked up on the second ring, confused, since Sarah had never had a reason to call him before. She asked him carefully whether he'd ever told anyone they'd spent a night together, because they hadn't, not once, and somehow that lie had ended up destroying her relationship. There was a long pause on the line before Ryan admitted that Jessica had once asked him for a favor back in the winter, asking him to say they'd grab drinks together if anyone ever asked, claiming she needed a cover story for a guy she was seeing behind her own boyfriend's back at the time. Ryan hadn't thought much of it. They were friendly acquaintances. He said sure, and never thought about it again until this exact phone call. Sarah felt something horrible click into place as Ryan spoke, a lock finally turning after 6 months of confusion. Jessica hadn't needed a cover story for herself at all. She had built one, quietly, patiently, and then flipped it, using Ryan's agreement to confirm a night out as false proof that Sarah had been the one cheating instead. It was never about protecting her own secret relationship. It was about manufacturing a name David would actually believe, a real person Sarah already knew, someone who could unknowingly back up a story that had never happened in the first place. Ryan's voice turned furious once he understood what he'd actually been used for, and he told Sarah he'd call David immediately and explain everything, But Sarah asked him to wait because she didn't want this to become another argument Jessica could spin her way out of. She wanted something undeniable. The undeniable proof came from Sarah's own phone records, the ones she'd never bothered pulling 6 months earlier because she'd been too devastated to fight for herself at the time. The records confirmed something she'd genuinely forgotten in the fog of everything that happened, that on the exact night David believed she'd been at a hotel with Ryan, her phone had actually pinged a cell tower 3 miles from her own apartment, nowhere near that hotel at all, because she had spent that entire night home sick with food poisoning, texting Jessica for sympathy from her own couch. Jessica, who had never once mentioned that detail in 6 months of consoling her through the breakup she herself had engineered. Sarah printed the records with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and then, for the first time since the night he walked out, she called David. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice cautious, clearly assuming this call was somehow about the wedding invitation. Sarah told him it wasn't, that she needed him to listen to something before he did anything else, and that she had proof she never cheated on him, proof that someone had spent months lying to both of them at once. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Sarah thought the call had dropped entirely, until David finally asked her to send him everything immediately, his voice stripped of every trace of the anger she remembered from 6 months earlier, and replaced with something that sounded almost like fear. He showed up at her apartment 40 minutes later, the crumpled wedding invitation still balled up in his fist, having already spoken to Ryan himself in the time it took him to drive over. David sat on Sarah's front step and told her he'd spent 6 months building an entire new life around hating her, and that he had no idea what to do with the fact that none of it had ever been true. He told her he was supposed to get married in 3 weeks. Sarah told him the truth as plainly as she could, that Jessica hadn't fallen for him after their breakup, that Jessica had engineered the breakup specifically so she could have him for herself, piece by piece, lie by lie, for months. David sat with that for a long time before finally admitting, quietly, that he had believed Jessica over Sarah without ever once asking a single follow-up question, despite 3 years of Sarah never once giving him a reason to doubt her. It wasn't an apology yet. It was just the truth, finally sitting out in the open between them. The confrontation happened 2 days later at Jessica's apartment because Sarah refused to give her the comfort of choosing where this conversation would take place. Jessica opened the door already crying, which told Sarah everything she needed to know, that some part of her had been waiting for this exact moment since Ryan stopped answering her calls. David walked in first, phone records in hand, his voice shaking with a kind of anger Sarah had never once seen directed at anyone but her, and he asked Jessica how she could watch him destroy the woman she claimed to love as a best friend, and say nothing the entire time. Then his voice cracked in a completely different way, and he asked her the question that had clearly been sitting under everything else. He asked if it was even true, what she'd told him in that hospital cafeteria, that Sarah had said she was tired of pretending, tired of the holidays and the hospital visits, tired of putting her life on hold for his father. He said he'd carried that around for a year without ever telling Sarah, without ever giving her the chance to explain, because he trusted the person who told him more than he trusted his own memory of every single night Sarah had actually shown up. Jessica's composure finally broke completely at that, years of careful friendship collapsing into something raw in front of both of them, and she admitted, quietly, that she'd made it up, that she'd been in love with David since college, long before Sarah ever knew he existed, and that watching Sarah get everything she'd ever wanted, including 3 straight nights at that cafeteria table beside him, had quietly poisoned something inside her for years. Sarah stood in that apartment and listened to 15 years of memories rearrange themselves in real time into something calculated and cruel. Every inside joke, every late-night phone call, Every moment she thought had been real, now sitting under a completely different light. Hearing about the hospital cafeteria lie for the first time, right there in that living room, was somehow the part that hurt worst of all. Because Sarah remembered those nights clearly, remembered holding David's hand in those hard plastic chairs, and she'd spent an entire year afterward feeling him pull away a little more each week, without ever understanding why. She told Jessica that none of it excused what she'd done, that wanting something someone else has doesn't give you permission to destroy their entire life to take it. And Jessica didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one. The wedding never happened. David called it off within the week, though Jessica kept the baby regardless, and the two of them were left to untangle a complicated, cold arrangement that would stretch on for years neither of them could have predicted that day. Sarah didn't get back together with David, which surprised almost everyone who expected a tidy ending stitched up with a bow. Something had broken in that relationship long before Jessica ever planted a single lie. The simple fact that David had believed 6 months of manufactured doubt over 3 years of real trust. The fact that he never once gave Sarah the benefit of it. What Sarah got instead was quieter and harder won. Her name, finally cleared, her own reflection, steady in the mirror again, and a slow, rebuilding trust in her own judgment, even after the person she loved most had spent months trying to convince her she couldn't trust it at all. Some mornings she still thinks about that gold foil invitation catching the light, and the exact second she watched Jessica's hand drift to her own stomach, protecting a secret that had already cost her everything. If someone in your life has ever done something like this to you, I want you to tell me about it in the comments below, because I promise you, you are not the only one. And before you go, if this story kept you here until the very end, that's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Subscribe to Unfinished Tales, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me what part hit you hardest. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next story.